I'm Anton, and I'm a climatologist, and chances are you might be too. Climatologists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. So if you too have pondered how we get to a future where clean, regenerative policy is embedded with profitable business models, the climatologist movement may just be for you. In this series, I'll be proving that climatologists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles. When you think of the act of protesting, what comes to mind? Chances are you probably see crowds of angry people holding signs or rallying for action. Maybe you even see rioting and acts of violence and political turmoil. But it's words like anger, violence and rioting that seem to immediately spring to mind, even though a lot of protests lead to positive change. But let's focus on that last word, positive. Can protest be positive? Can conflict be positive? Do we have the tools to apply pressure on political parties and on businesses in a way that's actually mutually beneficial? Sure, it might sound idealistic, but in our current climate emergency, this approach to protest may be the key to unlock the change we need from the top down. Fortunately, my guest on this week's podcast is showing us that the power of positive protest has been working for years and in a big way. I got the opportunity to speak to David Ritter, the Asia-Pacific leader in one of the most prominent forces for change on the planet, Greenpeace. This organisation needs no introduction. They've been at the centre of using direct pressure and focused action paired with corporate and government engagement to drive major environmental progress. When you think of Greenpeace, it's likely that the global anti-whaling movement in the 70s springs to mind. And the fact that in Australia, this action contributed to the government's decision to cease whaling altogether in 1979. That shows the power of protest, but Greenpeace's achievements haven't let up since then. From pressuring Woolworths to eliminate deforestation from its beef supply chain by 2025, to permanently banning super trawlers from entering Australian waters to protect the local marine ecosystem, Greenpeace's recent impact on the Australian environmental landscape has been immense. And for the last decade, David has been at the centre of all of it. I spoke to David about Greenpeace's presence in Australia and tap into this idea of conflict as a positive motivator, especially in the fight for climate action. David lays out his achievements in this field.
That was the equivalent of the whole of Tasmania, every home in Tasmania solarising overnight.
And similar to his views on conflict, encourages us all to see the positive steps we've already taken to curbing climate change.
If there is one thing we know, it is that human beings working together can achieve practically anything.
And what does all of this mean for us in the business world? Well, with Greenpeace successfully putting pressure on major corporations and governments to adopt cleaner practices, they're helping to shape a culture and a set of values for all businesses to critically reflect on their ways of operating, and encouraging workers to not tolerate unsustainable climate practices. I had an amazing chat with David, so stay tuned. David, welcome to Climatologist.
Thank you very much.
So it's great to have you here. There's a lot I want to ask you in our short time together, but I'd like to start with a little bit about your journey. One thing we have in common, which we've just talked about, is that we both studied and started out in law before changing tack and doing something different. What got you into law initially?
Yeah, so we're both recovering lawyers.
That's a good one.
I mean, look, at some level, it's what do you do in the world if you're better with words than you are with numbers. So there's a little bit of that. But I guess I was also one of those folks, and there are many people like this who are attracted to the idea of doing something to aid the cause of justice. And, you're 17 or younger or older, you don't really necessarily know what that means, but it does, have this kind of magnetic attraction. But I think the real moment for me, the sort of galvanising moment, was when a particular law lecturer had this line of, all too often law is made for the benefit of those on the riverbank, not for those who are drowning. And I remember just sitting up at that point and thinking, right, there's a role then to try and secure law to be on the side of those who would otherwise be drowning. And that was a really galvanising moment for me in terms of doing law and why you want to be a lawyer.
It's a pretty powerful thing, law. I think it can drive
material change when it's used in the right way. And one of the early things that you focused on as a lawyer, because you did have a legal career, was native title. Native title was something that developed out of judicial precedent. So what attracted you to it? Was it an example of that playing out?
Look, I think that's a terrifically framed question. I mean, the extraordinary thing about native title and the Mabo decision handed down in 1992, for the first time, native title is recognised as existing under the common law of Australia. And as you put it, it was a moment where the opportunity for a kind of justice that was about changing the material conditions and the political conditions for the Indigenous peoples of Australia, First Nations, as is now the preferred term, came into being. And it was a very exciting time where the law seemed to have really extraordinary transformative potential. And I think that transformative potential was in significant part realised, but I think it also could have been far more transformative if Australian politics in the 1990s hadn't really cruelled the potential of native title to drive something even more profound. And honestly, I think we're still working through the consequences of that turning away from justice in the 1990s.
God, I could jump into that. I mean, I grew up in New Zealand, and there's such a disparity in terms of the way that the Maori have prosecuted, their process, and the way that judicial precedents set the stage for politics to act. Australia, it's just played out very differently.
Yeah, treaty, yeah.
The treaty makes a big difference. Yeah. So legal career, we won't stay too long on the recovering legal career. You had a successful career, and you were making a difference in the native title space. What led you to making a decision to pursue advocating for the planet?
Yeah, look, I mean, I really loved the work that I was doing, and there was first of all a career for by Perth standards, at least, a large commercial firm. Though that firm itself had a practice acting for First Nations as well as acting for commercial interests, which was quite unusual for a large West Australian firm. But I loved it for that. But then an Indigenous leader sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, come and work for me at the Yamaji Mulba Land and Sea Council, as it is now called. It was called something else then. And that was, there's no better word for it than honour. It's a real honour to work for a First Nations organisation with a First Nations board, a First Nations leader, having that privilege of traipsing around to places you wouldn't otherwise see because they're out in the scrub, and receiving your instructions and then, doing your best to drive that cause. Honestly, any young lawyers out there, it's work I'd encourage anyone to try their hand at, because it's just, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal work that is such a privilege to have the opportunity to do. But I think there did come a point with me where, although I loved the work and I was deeply committed to the First Nations of that region, there did just sort of come a point where I became almost impatient with the idea that I was acting for someone else. It almost felt like I wanted more skin in the game, if I can put it that way. And I don't think there was the ability to do that in that context because of the very appropriate limits to what it means to be a lawyer, to be a representative. And I'd always had the sort of ecological side. The very first demo I remember going to was about Perth's public rail system. I'd loved Greenpeace since very early on in life through a variety of just sort of juxtapositions and sort of awareness. And there was an opportunity. I followed a girl to London, who I've now been with for more than 20 years. But I no longer wanted to be a lawyer. I'd followed a girl to London, and there was a job for Greenpeace, and I thought, oh, really? Maybe? I'm not even sure if I've got the right qualifications, but I had the love for the cause, and I guess the sort of deep alignment to the values, and it's been an extraordinary again, extraordinary privilege and a journey to work with the people at Greenpeace ever since.
So let's drill into that a little bit. So you mentioned demonstrations, activism, this kind of this advocacy role, which is coming through in some of the language you're using. Anything around nature? So early in your life, like were you a surfer? Any
surfer? I'm not. I mean, I can.
Here we go.
Look, a mate once said to me that I look like a wind-up monkey in a bowl of porridge when I try to swim. It's a very unattractive. And I've said. Got on record noting that a few times. I'm hopeless in water, but I did grow up in Perth's foothills, and getting my hands and my feet in the mud of the creek at the bottom of the orchard is not a sort of fond memory. It was just kind of day-to-day life. So I really, in that kind of deep way that if you're lucky as a kid you can get to, I just grew up with it sort of all around. I mean, there were insects in the sky, there were birds on the window, the lizards rustling through the grass, the whole box and dice of just what it means to grow up with nature as a given. But even then, to also be conscious of its vulnerability. And one of the sort of defining early ecological memories for me is that there are these natural freshwater crayfish in Western Australia called marron, big things, and they used to be very prevalent in the creek at the bottom of our orchard. And one day a bloke turned up with a snorkel and a spear gun and a sack, and that was that. The local population was essentially just wiped out in one intervention. Now, that happened before I was born, but the story of that is something that I used to dream about as a kid, of the bloke with the sack and the spear that wiped out these things that I would see very, very occasionally, and it was always a source of excitement if we happened to, if there was one that sort of turned up from somewhere. But that's a deep memory for me, and one of, I guess, a few things like that sort of, they lodge inside you as things that spur you through life.
Fascinating. Sort of acute vulnerability.
The acute vulnerability in the way that things can change. And, it was a recurring dream of mine in childhood, this, but the man never has a face in the dream. It's just the man with the sack and the spear gun, but there's never any face.
Fascinating. Let's talk about Greenpeace. You've been CEO at Greenpeace Asia Pacific for over a decade. That's a long time to be in any role, let alone one that takes as much energy as leading Greenpeace. How do you feel today versus the early years?
Well, I like to joke, but it's actually not a joke. It's true that I still feel like skipping when I'm on my way to work. And it's not skipping because the work is joyful in one sense, because it's contesting the time of ecological and climate emergency that we're in, but it is a sort of internal joy that goes with working for an organisation you love, with values you share, and a cause that could not be more important, with a team who you think are just absolutely terrific. So in some respects it feels exactly the same as it sort of felt on the first day, but in other respects, the organisation and the world has been through very significant evolution in that time. I mean, 12 years ago, I remember sitting down with a sort of hard-bitten, good guy, hard-bitten ex-journo saying to me, "No, coal in this country, David, you got to be kidding. You're not going to displace coal." Now, 12 years later, I mean, coal is as good as done. That monumental moment when AGL's leadership said, well, we are no longer going to pursue coal. We are going to have the power stations closed by 2035 or sooner, and did that in response to a campaign by Greenpeace and others. That was just the moment that epitomised the fact that this commodity that as little as 12 years ago people say, it's there forever, is widely recognised. The days are over. So there have been changes in the organisation and changes in the world that mean it also feels like in some respect it's a very different role now.
So talking about the organisation, I grew up in New Zealand, and the first story that I remember about Greenpeace was the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. Yeah. It's safe to say that Greenpeace in those days was a different kind of activist. How's it changed? Is it for the better?
Well, I think you're not alone in having that as a sort of just a central moment in consciousness of Greenpeace, and for me too. I mean, I grew up sort of a bit up Albany Highway from where Greenpeace was. I began operations in Australia contesting whaling off Albany in 1977. But I can remember where I was in my bedroom in Kalamunda in Perth's foothills when I heard the news of the Rainbow Warrior being bombed. And my favourite song shortly thereafterwards, and in fact still, is the Midnight Oil song Hercules, which was nicknamed the Ode to the Rainbow Warrior. So that sense of the martyrdom of the Rainbow Warrior and the murder of Fernando Pereira, the photographer who was on board, is still very live inside Greenpeace, and I think very live as a memory for people of a certain generation, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. Greenpeace has had to evolve because the 1980s are a long time ago, and particularly when you have a model of change which in many respects relies on unearthing the truth and disrupting existing power patterns on the basis of the truth that you have unearthed. That's very different in an age before mobile phones, before disruption becomes part of every institution's business as usual. And Greenpeace itself then was one of only a few environmental organisations. There were no climate organisations. Now there are many more. Now that's a great thing. That's fantastic. But it also just means it is a more complex, there's a richer ecosystem of actors. I mean, businesses will now all say they are green with varying degrees of sort of truth to that. So there has been such a change in the external world. But I think one thing that remains absolutely the same is that Greenpeace then and now had a core set of values around commitment to peaceful activism, around beginning from a basis of scientific truth, always campaigning on the ecological foundations of the earth through a lens of justice, of boats as a really central part, not just of our identity, but of how we are effective, because you can expose what people don't want to see going on at sea. And perhaps above all, in a commitment to simultaneously being radical and sophisticated, that these two things are not in opposition, but mutually reinforcing to achieve campaign goals.
Radical and sophisticated. Tell me about that. That's an interesting place to double click on.
Yeah, well, there's a sort of assumption sometimes that if you pursue a set of politics that are about big changes in the world, that you must be not have a sort of thoughtful approach to that. That doesn't need to be the case at all. And my experience when I first arrived as a staff member at Greenpeace UK was to immediately find an organisation with an internal culture and a staff body that was both really morally serious, but also where everything was driven by a sort of scalpel of strategic scrutiny. And so you might simultaneously have a situation where activists would be climbing a building dressed in shark suits and dropping a banner, but at the same time that would be accompanied by strategies that involved interrogating the application of consumer law, or the way in which there was an opportunity under some international trade agreement to create pressure, or the way in which community-based activism created a different kind of lever. So it was always taking a look at the situation in its totality and pursuing things that were the kind of classic radical intervention of a direct action to stop harm, but also accompanied by other things that went on behind closed doors or in courtrooms. Being unafraid to challenge brands publicly, but also always being prepared to have those conversations about, well, what changes do need to take place in the supply line to recognise that there always needed to be that dialogue open.
And that's something that's a good point for us to pivot. That's something that really struck me. I saw you speak here at Greenhouse a few weeks ago, and something that really hit me was you mentioned working with corporations to help them do better. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I think there's got to be a starting point of coming to any business, any politician for that matter, any institution, universities and so on, in an open-handed way, where what you're really doing is saying, look, there's an ecological problem in the world, and maybe it's deforestation, or maybe it's overfishing, or maybe it's your emissions are driving climate change, but there's a problem and there's a solution, and what we want here is the solution. And because Greenpeace never accepts any money from any government or any business, it's sort of, there's none of that element to it. It's all a question of it's clean hands. It's what matters here is the goal in the world. And you also come, and I sometimes sort of get an occasional business eyebrow raised at me about this, but to also approach these meetings with a sense of love, that this is not about a fight, that it's not about domination or something, that it's about a deep love of humanity and a deep love of nature, and an opportunity for a decision maker or a business to simply make a set of decisions that are going to be better for humanity and for nature. And so if you approach it with that degree of openness, all sorts of opportunities then emerge for getting progress together. On the other hand, where there isn't that willingness, then equally to be unafraid to engage quite critically with business or with politicians. But again, it's always coming from that position of, look, what drives us here is care. What drives us here is, love of people, love of nature, and seeing always that opportunity for politicians to stand up and be heroes, for businesses to be able to stand up to their stakeholders and say, look at what we've done here. Those are the moments that we're always seeking.
And do you start from the point of engagement? Or do you start advocating for an issue and then identify people that you might be able to work with?
There's usually a sort of phased approach that'll begin with a sort of a kind of ambient positioning on an issue. So you'll start talking, for example, about deforestation, or about how businesses source their electricity, to use one current live and one recent campaign example. We do have some breaking news as well, which we might get to in a moment, which is breaking news today. But so there'll be some sort of ambient positioning on the issue from Greenpeace, but usually the issues will be out there in the world. There'll be a body of scientific research and so on. And then there'll often be some opening gambit, like a set of letters to actors that begins to engage with them. So one of the sort of first activities I had to do in Greenpeace UK was a set of letters to the top 7 or 8 retailers in the United Kingdom around how they were sourcing their seafood supplies. And so that's how it starts. And then you engage in a set of meetings, and then that will roll on to potentially live dialogues or active campaigning, and the thing will then have its own journey.
Got it. And those dialogues, so the point at which you engage with business is when in that journey?
Yeah, well, it's at the outset.
At the outset.
Yeah, because the very best campaign is one that's not necessary.
I love that. So starting from a position of love, walk me through an example of where you've had success through the process.
Yeah.
Working with a business.
Well, let's talk about that Re-Energise campaign, which began from the place of frustration that Australia was in. If we remember the days of the sort of Morrison government, but let's not just make it about the Morrison government, there'd been years of sort of broken policy making on climate. So the problem was, well, how do we get movement on reducing emissions when we're simply seeing a lack of good policy making from those from whom we should be getting it, our federal politicians? And so the idea emerged from a set of wise and clever folk, of whom I was not one, that Australia's largest source of emissions is by sector is electricity. The largest users of electricity are big institutions, particularly a number of front-facing corporations. So if you could get those businesses in particular to make commitments to shift from electricity derived from fossil fuels to electricity derived from renewables, you'd not only achieve a really significant drop in actual emissions, but you'd also drive investment in renewables in a way that would make up for the policy shortfall. You could potentially change public expectations around the reliability of renewables and the role of business. There'd be all sorts of magnifier effects. So, and the campaign was nicknamed Re-Energise, and it began with a sort of league table of businesses, and then it involved extensive engagement with major businesses. And we're talking, household names, your Woolworths, your Coles, Aldi's, Bunnings, Telstra, Optus, so really well-known brands and trusted brands as well. So, there was a moment when we realised that then, according to Roy Morgan, the top 5 most trusted brands were all, in play. And one after another, these really significant brands made the decision to commit to sourcing their electricity from wholly renewable sources by 2025 or sooner. One after another. And the significance of those announcements, the statistic that I sort of like the best is when Brad Banducci, Woolworths, sort of said, okay, we're going to do this, that was the equivalent of the whole of Tasmania, every home in Tasmania solarising overnight. The significance of Coles and Woolworths in particular is, they're both top 10, I forget the exact positioning, electricity use in Australia. We're talking really significant shifts in demand, measurable drops in emissions, driving investment in renewables, and then to actually see the businesses themselves go out there together to zero, or in Aldi's case, they said, well, we can do this by the end of 2021, and they beat their own target by 6 months. And all of a sudden, you've got this sort of excitement of good emissions reduction work becoming the norm, and leaving behind the sort of dysfunction in Canberra. So this was a moment to just be able to say, look, great stuff, credit where credit is due. And I remember being at the launch of the Coles commitment, literally doing media in the deodorant aisle of the Moonee Ponds Coles outlet in Melbourne, and sort of saying, I really expect the revolution to begin in the deodorant aisle of Coles at Moonee Ponds. But the point is that it's credit where credit is due, and those sorts of commitments have made a really significant difference to our progress in the middle of a climate emergency, and it was exactly what we needed at that time. And so fair play to every one of those decision makers for making the decision they did.
You were very gracious. I'm sure there were some tense conversations. Walk me through a conversation. We don't need to name names, but you're talking with a CEO of one of these large organisations. What does that conversation look like?
Well, and sometimes these conversations do occur at CEO level, and sometimes they don't. And it will depend on a variety of factors, but and it will also depend sort of where in a campaign there is. With one, and I won't name names, but in one conversation, for example, the very genial and I must say impressive CEO, in the sense that he had a very good command of the brief in the meeting, sort of wryly smiled at me and said, look, we're enjoying your activists visiting us with placards at our stores, because they've been incredibly well-mannered and, nice to have around. But, can you just make sure that they do wear enclosed shoes? Because this is a shop, and we actually... So... sometimes the conversations do touch on those sort of real world activities. Sometimes the conversations are a bit more sort of into the weeds, and of course there can be tension. That's not unhealthy in any major decision made by a major institution, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. Sometimes there is an element of persuasion that has to go on in these conversations, but the really striking thing was that there was a common pattern to each one of the CEO conversations that I had, that sort of went, look, we've done the numbers and we can see how this can work. It's been incredibly popular with all of the stakeholders we've tested this with. We've been surprised how popular, this in some instances, how, we're told it's going to be, and in other instances after the announcement has been made, how popular it has been. One guy said, I've never had an email that's been to, the team that's been met with greater response than this. And then the third thing and they've all had their own ways of putting this, but it's been something around, and I'm a person too, and I've got to look my kids in the eye too. And this has been a moment when business strategy and the right thing has aligned. And that pattern of those 1, 2, 3, not necessarily in that order, but always those three things, and often in that order, very, very common to all those conversations.
So this is interesting. It's come up repeatedly in my early conversations on the podcast. Profit, purpose, costs. So costs is always an early focus, but it sounds like purpose and profit maybe mitigating some of that in the changes that you're seeing.
Yeah, look, the point about businesses, under the corpus law, we know the requirement to maximise returns for shareholders. That's simply a truth of how these things work, and I think it's actually really important to recognise just the truth of that, because that means you're not going into negotiations or campaigns or meetings expecting businesses to be things they are not. The point, I think, is always to try and reach a situation where the system enables and aligns with business serving the wider purpose of the community, and not just sort of relying on the good nature of a particular CEO to achieve that. So ideally you have a situation where you've got rules that are making it competition neutral for businesses to simply do the right thing by people and the planet. Now, in terms of those other drivers of purpose and is profit, purpose, and what was the third one?
Cost.
So cost, profit, and purpose. So I think every business wants to have a purpose aligned to doing the right thing. And when it emerges that purpose and actual impact on the planet are in disalignment, there's real disarray that can come from that in a really deep way. The dissatisfaction of staff, the troubling voices of executives. I mean, you can sort of see this, and they have all sorts.
Dissonance.
It's a dissonance, it's a cognitive dissonance, when the mission statement says one thing, planet, and then you've got a report from Greenpeace or WWF or Human Rights Watch or whoever it might be, just saying, well, hang on, this actually isn't the truth. So I think it's essential to ensure that there is a truth to that purpose. Absolutely no question about it. And in terms of profit, well, the risk that comes with not getting these things right are, I think, often really quite significantly underestimated, and that underestimation is only increasing as the world becomes a place that is under greater pressure from the climate and ecological emergencies, and as demands for action are only getting louder and louder. Just no question about that, I think.
Yeah, risk and impact. So act now or get in trouble down the track.
Well, absolutely. And I think, as recovering commercial lawyers, we probably both had experiences of just hoping that one's clients were really taking seriously the sort of risks that were on the horizon. And I think that the reality is that no human being has ever lived in an earth of the kind that we have now engineered because of the burning of coal, oil and gas primarily. The risks that are coming with that, the fluctuations in temperature, the severe climate impacts, no human being, let alone any business leader, has ever operated in the environment that, even if we do everything right from now, is upon us. So it's on all of us, but particularly on those with decision-making power, to do the right thing. Yes, it's doing the right thing by their own families, by the places they love in the world, but it's also, frankly, doing what they can to align future business strategy with a reality that is very, very changed.
Yeah, you've got to move with the times. So, should we talk about the breaking news? It sounds like might be in the area of forestry.
Let's talk about some breaking news. So, we'll start with the problem first, which is that many Australians are unaware of the sort of rather sad truth that we are a global deforestation hotspot, and the only developed country in the world that was named as a deforestation hotspot in a kind of landmark report by our colleagues at WWF from a couple of years ago. Now, what that means in practice is, for example, in Queensland, which is the real centre of deforestation from agriculture in particular, we saw just in the last 12 months of figures that were released, so not the most immediate preceding 12 months, but the latest 12 months we have figures for, an area of recognised endangered species habitat more than 5 times the size of Singapore bulldozed. Now, we're talking about very large areas, and the consequences of that in terms of native wildlife are, again, by the latest report, which is a collaboration between Greenpeace and our terrific mates at RSPCA Queensland, was that 100 million native vertebrates, are killed, injured or displaced by this deforestation that is taking place. Now, that's at a phenomenal level. It's contributing to the fears that the koala will end up extinct in, for example, southern Queensland. The greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation in Australia are, the figures are, again, not transparent, the official figures, but estimates range between 6 and 20%. That range, whether it's 6, whether it's 20, that's significant when you're talking about a proportion of Australia's annual domestic emissions. So this is a really structurally significant problem. Greenpeace should be involved in campaigns that have that level of scale to them. We've been fortunate to be working on the deforestation issue with a terrific coalition that includes the Wilderness Society and ACF and others. And one of the great things about working as part of the environmental and climate movement is always that opportunity to work in coalition and collaboration, because we're always stronger when we do things together. Now, the driver of this deforestation in Queensland, the principal driver, is for beef production. So it's you bulldoze your koala habitat, you get in the cows, then you kill the cows end up where? Burgers at McDonald's, burgers at Hungry Jack's, beef products at the likes of Coles and Woolworths. Now, the fantastic news, and which literally is breaking today, is that Woolworths have done the right thing, full credit to them. They've made the commitment as of today to be deforestation free in their supply chains by 2025. It brings them into a line with a series of global best practice initiatives. Now, that's just fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. And again, when you've got the likes of Greenpeace and others, going with these big asks to the like of Woolworths and naming them publicly and producing the reports, and the campaigns are on foot, what you want to see is that kind of leadership. Well, we've seen it today, and credit where credit is due.
It's amazing. So that's the power of large corporations taking a strong stance on this stuff.
Absolutely. And, for I doubt there's anyone working at Woolworths that hates koalas. So, for everyone working at Woolworths...
It's a good way of framing it, David.
What a...
Eat beef, kill the koalas.
What a terrific day to be a Woolworths employee, to go, that's fantastic. I'm going to work for a place that's going to eliminate this from our product. That's a really good moment.
That is brilliant. All right. Well, let's turn to deep sea mining. And this is an interesting area for me. So my father was a commercial fisherman in New Zealand, so I grew up around the sea, and sometimes the contentious relationship between fishing and sustainability. I'm really curious for that reason about deep sea mining. Let's set the scene. There's a giant transition happening to renewable energy and mass electrification to move us away from oil and gas. To power that transition, we need an equally giant increase in access to minerals that are critical for us to build batteries, solar panels, and so on. We know that some of those resources are available on the seabed, but extracting those resources from the seabed raises some interesting environmental challenges. What are those challenges?
Well, you'll appreciate, I hope, that before I get to the challenges, I do have to acknowledge their family history in fishing. And just to say that some of the most wonderful Greenpeace campaigns I've been involved with over the years have been those where we've made common cause with parts of the fishing industry to do the right thing collectively, and it's achieved some truly remarkable results. Reform of the common fisheries policy in Europe, keeping the super trawler out in Australia many years ago, a bunch of other stuff. So just to acknowledge that kind of, what's possible there.
Dad was all about sustainability, so.
Well, good on him. So there's no doubt that we have to transform our society, our economy at emergency speed and scale now, and we need to do that with kindness, with fairness, with the kind of eye to transforming societies in a way that says, well, how can we do this in a way that actually increases flourishing generally? It is an opportunity to do the right thing by people and to do the right thing by nature. But it is also true that in order to achieve that transformation, we do need to do new things on the face of the earth. So we need new solar, we need new wind, and we need critical minerals to play the necessary part they do in the engineering. None of that creates a basis for saying that there should be allowed to be unleashed a highly extractive, destructive industry on one of the last places on the planet that has escaped that kind of impact. No, you don't want to solve one problem by creating another problem. And the reality is that we don't need it. We need a more careful use of the land-based resources. Of course, we need good environmental and human rights protections around all mineral extraction on land. And in fact, all human activities need to be conducted in this way if we're going to sort of get the world to a place where more people have the opportunities for a flourishing life and our ecology is recovering. So that's a sort of general truth, and it just seems to me there's just something fundamentally wrong-headed about saying, well, we want to try and solve this problem by start ripping up the ocean bed. There's something not right with that reasoning.
So let's dig into this a little bit. We have a climate emergency. We're rolling at it at a rate of knots. Gun to your head.
Yep.
Don't touch the seabed.
You don't need to touch the seabed. You need to use better the minerals we already have. We can actually be a key driver of the kind of change that we need to a more circular economy. So we should actually be looking at it as being a really valuable driver of that kind of shift so that the economy itself starts to become lower waste. And it's not just the likes of NGOs. It's also the majority of Pacific Island nations who are deeply concerned about what ripping up the seabed can do to ocean currents, can do to fish stocks, because these things simply aren't known. Large-scale businesses, the likes of BMW and Volvo and others, have said, well, look, we really don't want to touch anything that comes from the seabed. So it's just not necessary. So let's not embark on a sort of crazy destructive thing that we don't need.
So there's a little bit of this, or there's quite a lot of this in the climate change space, particularly around technology, where you have second and third order impacts of change. So there are interesting issues around some battery minerals, social impact in parts of Africa where those minerals come from. And as the rate of extraction increases, we're dealing with change. We don't always know how the system's going to respond to change. Is this an example of that kind of thing that we need to avoid, or what principles might we use as we're going through a big change like this to govern the things that we will and won't accept in a transition?
Yeah, well, I think we do need to have an abiding principles of fairness and equity. I mean, yes, we need minerals quickly, and we need some of those to come from, as I say, better use of what is already out there. This can be a real driver towards shifting towards a more circular economy. But in no instance should we be saying, now's the time to break some eggs. That's not the case. We should be looking at this the other way of saying, well, we do need to move at speed and scale. So this is also an opportunity to embed some new ways of doing things and to make those sorts of reforms. So we're actually treating humanity with more dignity, with greater fairness than we were before. Now let's use the transformative opportunity not to dig ourselves further into the hole that we're in, but instead to take it as an opportunity to do things differently and better. Like, that's the opportunity that's in front of us. Let's not use it as an excuse to entrench some of the old bad stuff.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think it's an interesting, this issue of lines. I guess, what are the values that we take forward from this?
Yeah. Well, I think there is again a real opportunity to do a bit of resetting around some of the values that most human beings hold in common. And if you sort of stop to think about it for a moment, we probably do sort of collectively don't even need to think about a lot of these things. So the idea, for example, that all human beings should have time, should have security, should have access to green space, should have the sense in the back of their head that when life gets tough or when they have moments of vulnerability, that there is a safety net that will actually catch them, because we all have these moments of vulnerability. To recognise that all of us do seek a purpose in life that is just so much more than being mined for data by someone else or treated as someone's kind of human capital, or simply a demographic on a sort of electoral database or something. That we all have this kind of that every human being has this kind of miraculous sense about them, and that the opportunity for each person to flourish, the opportunity for each person to be treated with dignity, and so to be wanting to drive to a set of systems where people feel like they are treated with respect and dignity, not contempt, not simply for what the system, what others can get out of them. No, that's what we can be using this moment to drive towards. And in an ecological context, we are really at the sort of moment in the Mission Impossible film where, you're wondering what the choice is going to be from here. And the whole thing can sail off a cliff into a very, very sort of sad and dangerous planet. And there are some things that are already beyond our human ability to control. But on the other hand, the opportunity is still there to nourish and to create conditions for regeneration. And so that idea of driving change in a system so that every human being has more of an opportunity to flourish, to live their best life, has the opportunity to care and to self-actualise and to lead that full life in a world that is regenerating and returning to health. I mean, that's the kind of vision that I think we should be pursuing. And I think there is a permanent public majority around those sorts of ideas. And I think it speaks deeply to that inside all of us. What compels us every day? What are the last things we think of at night, the first in the morning, and the things that we will think of, in our sort of as we get towards the latter years of our lives. It's speaking to what is the truth, I think, of we human beings.
So I guess it's moving away from this extractive, let's take, and more about what we can give and what we can leave for those around us and for the next generation.
You've put that very succinctly. It's moving away from an extractive idea of people and of nature. I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but I mean, I look at my kids and I do not like the idea that my children are someone else's resource to be mined for profit. I do not like the idea that, my kids would go to a childhood education centre where what is being looked at is how can we extract the maximum value. If we, give them a slightly cheaper, less nutritious bread at lunch, we can, I do not like the idea that at the end of anyone's life, that the thing that is determinative of the care that person receives is some market mechanism somewhere or some failure of policy. We just need a change in how we look at these things for the good of us all and for the good of the planet we live on.
Very inspiring. So let's think about, just before we close out, think about conflict, right? So obviously, Greenpeace, when it confronts and tries to drive change, it will come into conflict with different interests, and we've talked about some of those things playing out. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think you can come at conflict many ways. You can come at conflict, and if we break down conflict into meaning, there are two opposing views, or on how power and resources are being deployed. You can come at conflict many different ways, but if you come at conflict with a set of principles around how you conduct yourself, that are about peacefulness, and are about non-violence, and are about not being in it for gain, and are about not being sort of driven by a will to dominate or something, but are instead being driven by objectives, and actually recognising that those objectives are often shared. It is driven by a set of values that are some of those things that we've talked about. A desire actually for everybody to flourish, and desire for the planet to flourish. Then it doesn't mean being afraid of speaking out, because we must have courage to take things on that are burning our planet and ruining. I mean, just dwell on this just for a moment. I like to walk my youngest to school every day, even though she doesn't need it anymore when I'm home. And we walk past the same childcare centre every day, and I listen to the kids every day when we walk past. And what I see in my head are the graphics of what business as usual means, both climate and biodiversity, for the life prospects of those children. Now, when we are talking about the destruction of the world as we know it, easily within the lifespans of the expected lifespans of those children, we must be prepared to take on power. We must be unafraid of taking on power. So, to the extent that involves a degree of conflict, it is all then about how we approach that conflict, and to approach it always with a set of values that are about peace, that are about the common good, that are about wanting the best for humanity and the best for the magnificently beautiful, wounded but unbelievably beautiful planet that we live on.
So wounded, you talked about this idea of certain things sailing off beyond our realm of control. Is there still, how do you find hope? Like, where do you find hope in the midst of all that we can actually tackle this?
Well, head down into Sydney Harbour or the beach beach off Sydney. Have a look at the whales swimming past, and remember that not so long ago those whales were headed for extinction, and now those whales swim past in ever increasing healthy numbers, because of the actions of people all over the world who stood up to save the whale. And remember that they are swimming past towards Antarctica, a whole continent that has been preserved for peace and science, because people, Greenpeace, but many others, stood up to say Antarctica is too precious to allow it to be ruined. And remember that great historic change is often non-linear, that the downfall of the Berlin Wall was largely unforeseen, that apartheid ending in the way that it did was largely unforeseen. Great historic change, these moments of extraordinary progress, are so often unforeseen. Now, there are all kinds of trends that are, and business as usual is unthinkable. But at the same time, you've got a researcher like Hannah Ritchie in the UK putting out credible data to say we might have hit peak pollution. We've got The Economist, that well-known lefty ratbag magazine, talking about how only Greenpeace predicted the global level of renewables uptake with anything like the degree of accuracy, and we were slammed as being dreamers, and in fact even we got it wrong, because it's been faster even than Greenpeace estimated. So we are in a tough spot. We are in a very, very tough spot here. But great historic change is non-linear. Extraordinary things have happened. If there is one thing we know, it is that human beings working together can achieve practically anything. And the only currency we have in this moment is what we actually do together. So we just get on with doing it.
One final question. So, and we ask this of every guest that comes on. This is a business podcast. Business is about opportunity. What opportunity do you think is being left on the table in the climate space?
I think the way I would answer that is by, if I were looking for opportunities, I'd be looking at what campaigners and activists and NGOs are doing. Because on the end of every campaign, there's an opportunity. And so, for example, when many years ago, and the first campaign I worked on for Greenpeace was about transforming the global tuna industry, because the largest traded seafood commodity, seafood was then, the figure we used to use is probably more now, roughly 1 billion people depended on seafood as a primary source of protein. So if you could shift the way tuna was caught, you'd do great things for ecology, but you'd also do great things for local employment, for opportunities for development and ownership of resources within Pacific Island nations. So lots of win-win-win. But anytime there's a change in a business, that creates opportunities for business people. So my piece of advice would be just go out and look at what activists, campaigners and NGOs are doing.
That is brilliant. It's a brilliant piece of advice. And congrats on the, another piece of congratulations on the recovery of the tuna stocks.
Oh, well, there was that campaign was called by The Independent in the UK. I remember one of the most successful environmental campaigns in years. And like all of these things, you just reflect back on the sheer number of people involved. You know, it's people in the UK, it's people in Europe, it's above all people in the Pacific, and every change we achieve in the world is always this symphony of people making their contributions, of doing their biggest thing to achieve that monumental change that then just becomes the fine print on a tin because it's now just normal.
I think that's a fantastic place to finish. I had some other questions, but that is the pièce de résistance. Thank you.
No, it's a great pleasure to have a chat. Thanks for having me in.
Once again, if you like listening today, then please subscribe to The Climatalist wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a follow on Instagram, where we're just Climatalist. I'm Anton. Thanks for listening.